If at first you don't succeed, try, try, try again. Words attributed to that great Scottish king, Robert the Bruce, and words often quoted to me by my dad when I was a child and struggling to master some new task, be it riding my bike without stabilizers, learning my times tables, or struggling to solve a puzzle. You are no doubt familiar with the tale. Having suffered yet another defeat at the hands of the English army, King Robert finds himself cowering in a cave at his wits' end, uncertain of his next move and feeling pretty downhearted. Whilst he is sitting there, he notices a spider, struggling to get back to their web, which was on the roof of the cave. Up the spider would climb, almost to the very top, only to fall back down to the floor of the cave. Time after time, the spider would begin his weary climb until success. He eventually made it back to his web. Through sheer persistence, the spider succeeded in his endeavours. Now, Robert the Bruce was inspired by this little spider, and, believing it to be a sign from God that he should continue in his battle with the English occupiers, he went out from the cave, mustered his army, and defeated the enemy at the Battle of Bannockburn. Here in Luke's Gospel, we find Jesus using that same metaphor of persistence to encourage us in our prayer lives and in our faith. The widow in the parable is very persistent. We don't know the nature of the issue for which she is seeking justice, but regardless, she is determined to have a fair hearing from the local judge, who is far from diligent in his duties. As we read in verse 2, he neither feared God nor cared about men. But the widow was undaunted. She kept turning up at the judge's house, he kept sending her away, and so it went on. Eventually, however, the judge had had enough. The widow's persistence wore him down, and he did indeed pass judgment on her case. Not because he cared about either her or the issue in hand, but simply because he wanted to get rid of her. Most of us have probably experienced that feeling of being worn down by someone who just won't go away. In everyone's life, there is that person who just keeps coming back, determined not to take no for an answer. And just like the judge, eventually you capitulate, simply because you want them to stop pestering you. This is far from an act of grace on our part, more like one of self-preservation. As Jesus goes on to teach us, if the uncaring, ungodly judge eventually dispenses justice, how much more likely is it that God will answer our prayers? Unlike the judge, God responds to our prayers because he does care. He loves us beyond measure and longs for us to flourish. God listens intently to our prayers and he answers them. Maybe not in the way we hope or in the time scale that we demand, but he answers them in the way that he knows will serve our best interests. God's response to our prayers reminds us of the importance of spending time with him in a way that enables us not just to ask him to resolve those things that lie heavily on our hearts, but to proclaim our gratitude for the blessings in our lives. Prayer is as much about listening as it is about speaking. It is a precious space that we enter with reverence, a gift, not a burden or an obligation. The widow sets us a good example. She is faithful, persistent, and patient. God will answer our prayers just as Jesus says he will, if we have faith. Jesus says in his conclusion to this parable, however, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Will he? Are we confident as individuals, as Christian communities, that when Jesus comes again, he will find a pilgrim people, a people whose faith remains firm in adversity, a people who are confident in their relationship with God and are passionate in their longing to serve him? Across the world, there are Christians living in a state of constant danger, for whom declaring their faith may result in loss of liberty, torture, or even death. If Jesus were to descend from heaven today and find himself in the midst of such bravery, he would indeed find faith on earth. But that is not a universal situation. There may be a proliferation of beautiful buildings in which God is worshipped, but that does not equate to faith. There might be statistics that suggest that there is still a reasonable percentage of people who consider themselves to be Christians, but that doesn't equate to faith either. Calling yourself a Christian and having faith are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Having faith requires persistence. Like the widow, we need to believe in the gospel consistently, even when we are ignored, even when it feels we are repeating ourselves to no effect. We need to be relentless in our endeavours, be firm in our faith, even when we struggle to find God in the reality of our lives, when we feel unworthy to come before him. Martin Luther once said, "A Christian without prayer is as impossible as a living person without a pulse." So let's take heart from the parable of the persistent widow, and maybe also from the tale of the spider in that cave so many centuries ago. Let's commit to maintain a steady pulse of prayer and keep the lifeblood of our faith healthy and vibrant. Amen.